Happy Wednesday, everyone. Thanks for joining. This is Brian Chaplin, founder of Medicine Box, with a mission to co-create human health and happiness while harmonizing our relationship with Mother Earth. And a lot of that mission is encompassed by the great wide world of plant medicine, botanicals, not limited to cannabis or hemp, although many of the products that we do design come from those plants and what I like to think of as the intrinsic powers within those plants, those plant compounds, cannabinoids, terpenes. And today, we have a very special guest, someone that has been a great muse of mine over the years as I've learned a lot about cannabis and terpenes and my fascination about terpenes. Dr. Ethan Russo, all the way up there in Washington. Thanks for joining us, Mr. Russo. He is the founder, CEO of Credo Science. He's also a board certified neurologist, psychopharmacology researcher, and founder, CEO of Credo Science. Previously, he was director of research and development for the International Cannabis and Cannabinoids Institute from 2017 to 2019, medical director of Phytex from 2015 to 2017, and from 2003 to 2014, senior medical advisor, medical monitor study physician to GW Pharmaceuticals for numerous phase 1 through 3 clinical trials of Savitex and Epidiolex. He was a clinical neurologist in Missoula, Montana for 20 years. He has held faculty appointments in pharmaceutical sciences at the University of Montana and in medicine at the University of Washington. He is author, editor of 7 books and has published more than 50 peer-reviewed articles and ad lib. Also a guitar man. If you move your head a little bit, Ethan, you can see all those guitars back there. And I didn't know Ethan was a guitar man like myself. And when I was thinking of a short form description of how I think of Ethan and his work, I credited him that Ethan is to terpenes what Jimmy Page is to guitar, one of my favorite guitarists. And what I mean by that is Jimmy Page was a very modern guitar man, grounded in, roots rock, rock and roll, jazz and blues. But he also had this very deep yearning for Eastern mysticism. And he used that to influence his music with Led Zeppelin or navigate the GPS system of his music with the rest of the guys there. And I think that's what Ethan does as a modern researcher, and the work that he does around cannabis. He dives much, much deeper than the just THC, just CBD cannabinoid research, and really gets down to the nitty gritty of terpenes. And a lot of the conversation that we're going to have today, I'd like to kind of frame it, Ethan, around a statement that came out of your article, which is what I call my Bible to cannabinoid medicine and terpenes, Taming THC. Quote, that the type of plant synergy may play a role in the widely held but not experimental based view that in some cases plants are better than drugs than the natural products isolated from them. So that's kind of like this anchor that I want to stay on. But at the beginning of your paper, Taming THC, you refer to terpenes, and I think it was a quote from one of the research papers that you quote in there, as the 5th element or life force in the botanical world. And would you drop into that a little bit and like break that down for us?
Sure. Well, that quote actually was from Professor Meshulam and Ben Shabbat in 1999. So that was a year after they coined the phrase the entourage effect, which originally referred to the combination of different endocannabinoids, the idea that there were certain main players, specifically the endocannabinoids, anandamide and 2-arachidonoglycerol, but there are like 100 or more related molecules that might not seem to do a lot on their own, but when they're present, they synergize with the main players. And they had pointed out in 1999, as you mentioned, that at that time they thought that it was theoretical that different components of cannabis would really contribute. But we've had 22 years in the interim to show that these synergies, boosting of effect, are a real thing. Um, and yeah, I saw already, I said I wasn't going to watch the chat, but there was already a question that I think I should address up front, and that is defining terms. So terpenes are hydrocarbons, just hydrogen and carbon, and they come in different flavors. Um, the 10 carbon ones are called monoterpenoids, 15 sesquiterpenoids, 20 diterpenoids, and triterpenoids have 30 carbons. We also have the term terpenoid. So terpenoid might have an oxygen or other molecules in it. It is, the way I was taught, the more encompassing term. So all terpenes are terpenoids, but not all terpenoids are terpenes. And I like the synergy of cannabinoids and terpenoids. And so I usually refer to terpenoids rather than terpenes, although most people do use the terms interchangeably.
Thanks for breaking that down. And speaking of that paper, Taming THC, what was your purpose for giving that publication the title?
Well, I'm actually glad you asked, but the occasion was Professor Meshulam's 80th birthday. They held a symposium in Jerusalem that I was invited to attend, and out of that came these papers. But I had amassed all this evidence of synergy of ingredients going back 15 years. Previously, John McPartland and I had written a predecessor to that paper in 2001, basically saying that these cannabis was more than the sum of its parts. And again, looking at synergies, but as often happens, there was a lot more ammunition that developed. But I wanted to address the different components and how they would act together to be more therapeutic, and really look at the issue of botanical synergy. So synergy is a boosting of effect. It can mean that you have two ingredients or several ingredients that are all painkillers, but synergy also can be a reduction of side effects. Now, it's well known that THC has some side effects. Everybody knows what they are. When there's too much, it can produce anxiety rather than reducing it. Um, it can produce paranoia. When it's really too much, people can get blood pressure drops and even get vomiting from it. So have always been interested in other ingredients that are going to mitigate those side effects and increase what's called the therapeutic index. The therapeutic index is the difference between the dose that's going to give you the effect you want therapeutically and that which produces side effects. Now, for some drugs, those are very narrow. Unless you keep it in that range, you're not going to get the benefit. And if you have too much, you're going to get side effects. So for THC as a single drug, the therapeutic index, this margin, is very small. When there are other ingredients present, particularly cannabidiol or things like limonene, linalool, pinene, you get a much wider gap so that you can take a much higher dose of THC and tolerate it well because the side effects are being reduced. As I usually like to, when the occasion permits, in my papers, I try to look at the historical context, because although cannabis might be new to a lot of people, it's not new to humankind at all. This is an agent that's been used therapeutically for thousands of years, but most people are not familiar with the history. And in that history, we have evidence that certain things were used as sort of antidotes to THC excess. And I wanted to look at those and also examine what science might tell us about whether they have a foundation. So that was the reason for the title, Taming THC, because again, on its own, THC is a rough drug, and needs a little help from these other things that the plant is kind enough to provide.
Need some navigation, right? I always think of terpenes as the navigational system, while the cannabinoids are the driving, the more of the mechanical part of the formulation. And
Yeah, they may well be the energy part, where the power source.
right. So you mentioned that word synergy multiple times. You also mentioned that your real joy comes from looking at the synergy of terpenes and cannabinoids. And you touched on it a little bit, but what role do some of the more abundant terpenes, myrcene, linalool, more of the soothing terpenes found in cannabis, as well as pinene and limonene, so the most abundant terpenes in all of the botanical world, play in enhancing a cannabinoid formulation's effects?
Sure. So let's go through. Well, certainly the most abundant terpene that we see in cannabis of commerce is going to be myrcene. So myrcene has some good effects and some bad effects. The good is, for people who need it, it's sedating. And it can be really sedating because there's definitely a synergy in that area between THC and myrcene. That's why I call it the couch lock compound. So I think most of this audience is going to be familiar with that concept. If there's a lot of THC and a lot of myrcene, you may be immobilized. And that's fine if you've had a rough day and you want to get to sleep, but it's not conducive, say, to the patient who has to function, work, or study. Um, Now, otherwise, myrcene does have analgesic effects. It has pain-killing effects, anti-inflammatory effects, but in general, there's almost always myrcene around, and we usually don't need a lot more of that. There are people that really like it, to be fair. What we see less of and would like to see more of in cannabis would be some of the others. So for example, alpha pinene is really key in reducing THC side effects. One of the primary problems with THC, or the amusing part of THC, is when everybody loses their train of thought and people laugh about it. But that effect, the short-term memory impairment that's inherent to THC, can really be mitigated or eliminated by alpha pinene. And we know how this works exactly. Um, Alpha pinene is what's known as an acetylcholinesterase inhibitor. Acetylcholine, of course, is a neurotransmitter, the memory molecule in the brain. So if you're inhibiting its breakdown, it means you remember well or better. But you don't even need to use cannabis to have this effect. For people that live in the West in coniferous forests, it's enough to go out and walk in the forest, what the Japanese call Shinrin Yoku, or forest bathing, and gaining the benefit of pinene that's in the atmosphere from the pine needles. So that's a key one. Limonene. Limonene is great as a mood elevator. That's why when you walk down the detergent aisle in the supermarket, you're bombarded with citrus scent. It's interesting because there's a lot of science behind this one as well. As it turns out, citrus oils are very good detergents. They're very good cleaning agents, but to our brains, they also connote cleanliness or an uplifted mood. And just limonene scent was used in a Japanese study some years ago, just wafted in the air, cutting hospitalized depressed patients' depression scores in half. So this really provides a brightness to the THC experience that it doesn't have as much without that component. Next on the list, I guess I'd put linalool. So linalool is very much a component of lavender. Lavender is well known as a safe calming agent without being really super sedating, and certainly not with any addiction potential. Um, Lavender scent, linalool specifically, has been used in studies of Alzheimer's disease patients to calm their agitation. And certainly it also can take the edge off anxiety inherent in too much THC. So linalool is clearly a terpenoid. It is an alcohol, and so it's got an oxygen in it. So that'd be a good example. I also should mention beta-caryophyllene. Beta-caryophyllene is a sesquiterpenoid, so it's 15 carbons. And it's a really interesting one because it is not just a terpenoid, but a cannabinoid as well. It had been known for thousands of years by indigenous people in South America that caryophyllene, as in copaiba balsam, was an excellent agent for wound healing and inflammation. And it turns out that it is a cannabinoid as well because it works on what's called the CB2 receptor. CB1 is a receptor that mediates the high of THC in the brain. CB2 receptors are mainly out in the body. It is immunomodulatory and anti-inflammatory without being intoxicating. So caryophyllene might have some minor effects on mood, but it does not contribute to the intoxication of THC. So those would be the main ones, and I would make the case that as the balance we usually see really favors myrcene, and you don't see alpha-pinene or limonene or linalool as much as I would like. But these are things that can be selectively bred into cannabis, and you know, in the best of all possible worlds, when somebody goes to the dispensary and there's a good selection, they could find material that has the right combination of components to treat what ails them.
Great breakdown. All my favorite terpenes. And now, just is this myth or fact that in order for an indica to be considered indica, it needs to have more than 50% concentration of myrcene in it?
Well, yeah, we've got one of my pet peeves here. The term sativa and indica is used in common parlance are nonsense. Um, you know, if this is a topic of interest, I can delve into what happened. Cannabis sativa is a name that Leonhard Fuchs brought up in the 16th century, and it was systematized by Linnaeus, who developed the real Latin binomial nomenclature of species. So he called it cannabis sativa, cultivated cannabis. About 25 years later, Lamarck in France described what he felt was a separate species, cannabis indica. But we know exactly what it looked like because a voucher, a sample of what he was calling cannabis indica still exists. And actually, it was a narrow leaf plant that was bushier than cannabis sativa, the hemp of Europe that Linnaeus was used to. However, in modern parlance, what most people call indica is more likely an Afghani plant that looks quite different. It would be 1 meter or 2 meters at most in height, with very broad leaflets, and be quite different from what Lamarck noted. We know that all types of cannabis can interbreed, and so the usual thought these days is that it's one species. What people call sativa would be a, quote, head high whereas indica is a body high. So if something has a lot of myrcene, people are apt to call it an indica, whether um, irrespective of what the leaflets look like, et cetera, et cetera. Rather than that nomenclature, I prefer to talk about chemovars, chemical varieties, or chemotypes. And this would refer to the balance of the different chemicals along with THC or CBD. Um, again, it's a little more technical, but it's just not accurate these days. It's been shown in multiple studies you can't, what people conceive of sativa and indica is not measurable by any scientific standards.
Right. It's been harder and harder to get back to those landrace genetics, but
Sure.
I'm sure there's a lot of people up in the, Emerald Triangle that have buried those genetics for the right time to release them. Um, Back to cannabinoids and terpenes.
Sure.
And you mentioned that THC is kind of just a dangerous compound on its own or a problem on its own. And what do you see some of the problems with what we call at Medicine Box, just THC or just CBD or
Right.
THC and CBD isolates?
Okay.
And
Sure.
and one more piece of that makes me think of my good friend Forrest Hurd. I don't know if you know Forrest and his son Silas in Nevada County, and he tried a variety of different um, formulations to treat the Lennox-Gastaut syndrome on his son Silas until he found a real effective full spectrum high CBD rich formulation. I think it was Tsunami Sue or ACDC, but also it had a lot of the other minor cannabinoids in there with the full spectrum. So really just want to like break down the problems with THC and CBD isolates.
Right. Okay, let's start with THC. Back in the 80s, it was already established that THC had antiemetic effects. In other words, it was good for treating nausea and vomiting associated with chemotherapy in people who had cancer. A company got permission to synthesize THC and eventually release it as a drug called Marinol. Um, Now, the government thought that this was going to obviate the need for people to use cannabis medicinally, but that never happened. And Marinol has had very poor sales figures in the ensuing 30 plus years. And there's a reason for that. As I mentioned previously, it's got that very narrow therapeutic index. Even people who are cannabis experienced find Marinol a rough ride because it tends to produce dysphoria, unhappiness, rather than euphoria. Um, it's very scattering. It's got a really erratic absorption. People might feel it anywhere from 30 minutes to 3 hours after taking a capsule. Um, and very few people can take it on a sustained basis. I know because between 1999, when it was downscheduled to Schedule 3, and 2003, I used it probably in about 35 patients with different conditions, and very few could manage it. Um, again, without these other elements to tame the THC, it's not a very versatile or acceptable drug on its own, which is not to detract from cannabis. I'm trying to create distinctions here. Um, with CBD, um, CBD is not a very potent drug. It's a very versatile drug. There are about 30 different things that it does therapeutically, almost all of them good, very few side effects associated with it. But in terms of numbers, you need a lot of milligrams of CBD to do most things when it's on its own. One of the illustrations of that is Epidiolex, a drug I worked on. For better or worse, ended up being a preparation of about 97% pure CBD. The FDA, Food and Drug Administration, wanted no part of the idea of using THC in kids. And the target population for the development of the drug was Lennox-Gastaut syndrome and Dravet syndrome. Neglecting the fact that THC has anticonvulsant, anti-seizure properties, and synergizes with CBD. And the evidence of that is we know what kind of doses are necessary with Epidiolex, pure CBD, and the effective doses when CBD has other components with it, THC and whatever else. The doses required for seizure control seem to be about 20% of those for CBD alone. So another demonstration of synergy of these other ingredients. Again, my experience and that of doctors I know and trust that treat patients with cannabis-based preparations is the greater diversity of ingredients leads to better clinical results. And that means more efficacy in treating a specific problem and fewer side effects. So, that really is the sine qua non, the goal of good medicine.
I like that. You mentioned that for CBD on its own to be really effective, you need a really high dose of that. What in milligrams, what would a high dose be considered for it
Sure.
to be
Well,
effective?
it varies with the indication. We know from experiments, mainly done in Brazil, for treatment of anxiety, you often need 300 milligrams or more. So that's much, much more than is going to be in a typical CBD preparation that's available in the US, online or wherever. For seizures, it's at least 20 milligrams per kilogram, and for an adult, it could be 1,500 or 2,000 milligrams a day, and that's going to be mega expensive.
Yeah.
So again, if nothing else, there are cost considerations to all of this. It's possible that people can get an inexpensive preparation at a dispensary compared to the enormous cost if somebody is paying for a prescription form. So this is a big problem.
You all heard it right there. When you're looking for CBD products and even THC products out in the marketplace, make sure it has a diversity of ingredients in there, especially
If you can.
terpenes. That's the one thing, not to self-promote Medicine Box, but that's the product direction that we've always taken, to make sure there's multiple plant compounds synergizing
Sure.
with
Let
each other.
me give one, if I may, one more example. A study was done, it was a rat study, it was done in Israel by Galili et al. And they were looking at the response of pain in the animals to CBD versus CBD extracts. So what happens with CBD alone is what's called a biphasic dose response curve. Let's break that down. What that means is at a low dose, it doesn't effectively treat pain. As the CBD dose is increased, there's a point at which it effectively treats pain. But if you go higher than that, the benefit on pain is lost. So like a hill, you want to be at the top of the hill in this instance. Now, when they used equivalent doses of CBD with other components present, instead of having a hill, it was a steady uprise. In other words, past a certain point, whatever dose was used, it still treated pain. So you want to retain that pain-killing ability, and that requires other components. And there are other examples from the literature.
Thanks, Ethan. Getting into some of the not so fun stuff, but the stuff that's always lurking around us as we are working with cannabis and CBD. The Schumer bill was recently announced, and if passed, The FDA would possess jurisdiction over cannabis and cannabis products. What steps would you like to see this agency take in the regulation of these plants in the industry at large?
Oh, that's a tough one.
Well, not so fun stuff, but
Um, uh, Let me say this. Irrespective of what politicians or anybody would like, there are going to always be three echelons of cannabis medicine. Herbal cannabis, some kind of supplements, hopefully with some level of quality control and availability of information about them. And finally, the top tier is pharmaceuticals. Um, FDA does pharmaceuticals. They know that business and can set the standards. They're not very good at the other aspects. For example, with supplements, they don't get involved until somebody complains. And they'll currently only intervene in cannabis supplements or things in the dispensary when there's a problem of some kind. Um, uh, I will say I certainly am familiar with all three aspects, and I know what I think a quality product is. But the main problem right now is lack of quality control in the industry, coupled with a lack of good information for the potential consumer.
mhm,
Now, some places a consumer can go into the dispensary and get a full certificate of analysis, COA, on the material that they're going to buy. But most often, the most they're going to get is a rundown of how much THC and CBD is in it. And that's not enough information for the kinds of things that we're talking about. Also, how meaningful is it if this was done 2 years ago on a different batch of material, and the current batch may not even vaguely resemble what was there before? So we hear about this all the time, particularly treating people with epilepsy, that they had this preparation, it was working well, and then all of a sudden it doesn't anymore. Well,
mhm.
people say, gee, it doesn't look the same, it doesn't smell the same, it doesn't taste the same as what happened before. And there's a reason for that, and it's because it's not the same.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
but
And
again, there are ways to have consistency, standardization, and maintain that over time. That's not to say it's easy, but it absolutely has been done and can be done again.
right, and more fun stuff. Everyone's trying to innovate. There's all types of scientists out there and opportunists, and there's been a rise in industrial terpenes for different types of cannabis formulations. Food grade terpenes. I think some terpenes that are now being derived from yeast, or is that cannabinoids? What should consumers know about their terpenes, and what are the best sources for them?
Sure.
I
All
I
right.
know where
Well,
I would agree,
disclaimer.
but
Yeah. Disclaimer here. I am on the scientific advisory board and work with True Terpenes, a company in Portland that makes these. Again, you've got three uh, types of terps in this conversation. One is what comes from the chemical supply houses like Sigma Aldrich. Those don't even come from plants. Generally, they're byproducts, petroleum distillates. They're usually not very pure, and they're not designed for human use. Um, so that's not likely a source that people would want. Next and better would be plant-derived terps. So for example, if you need linalool, it's usually going to be most effectively derived from lavender, although again, certain chemovars of cannabis will have a good amount of it. And third is hemp-derived or cannabis-derived terpenes. Now, the plant-derived and hemp-derived are going to be the proper stereoisomers. Stereoisomers refer to the 3D structure of the molecule. If it came from oil rather than a plant, it might be a mirror image of the correct three-dimensional structure, and it might smell the same, but it may not act the same pharmacologically. So, I think plant-derived terps, if they're made to high standards, with good manufacturing practice and with supervised labs and good quality control, they can be excellent. Ultimately, the best thing would be cannabis-derived terps. And for example, for products that are going to be on the market in New York State, it's going to be a requirement that everything be cannabis-derived.
That's in New York State. That's a
Right.
regulation.
Yes.
That's great to hear. New
Yeah,
York took a long
that
time to
part's
get
good.
there.
They otherwise haven't done a good job so
Yeah,
far
exactly.
getting medicine to the people that need it.
Now, I know a lot of our listeners definitely want to hear about the time you served as senior medical advisor for GW Pharmaceuticals. And now that you're out of there, do you feel that innovation in cannabis medicine can occur outside of the big pharma kind of framework?
Better. Uh, I mean, seriously, um, pharmaceuticals are developed usually with a specific target in mind, and they may or may not be ideally suited to that target. Um, Cannabis is not one thing. It is an endless variety of things depending on its biochemical contents. Now, the beauty of that is if we're ever going to get to individualized medicine, cannabis is ideal because um, if you have the right components, it can be extremely versatile in treating countless disorders because it's tapping into the endocannabinoid system, which is the major homeostatic regulator of physiology. In other words, it's the thing that keeps in balance all of our bodily functions. That's what creates the versatility. It's not some psychological thing that makes it good for so many different illnesses.
Great. And speaking of, innovations with terpenes, cannabinoids, formulations, uh, what promise do you see in combining terpenes and cannabinoids with other herbs, nootropics, and even medicinal mushroom extracts? Lion's mane, cordyceps, turkey tail, all the fungal kingdom, and what's possible, and how can those synergize together?
Well, again, I'm a believer in botanical medicine. And as it turns out, cannabis combines well both with conventional medicine and other botanicals. Second disclaimer, I am working with cookies. They have a line of products called Caps by Cookies that do combine uh, cannabinoids with terps and with medicinal mushrooms. And from what I understand, people seem to like them. But cannabis, among other things, is an herb, and a good herbalist will often use multiple different agents. When we're dealing with complex diseases, it's often not enough to use one agent.
Mhm.
Often we have to think of multiple different things. And so these combinations often can make a lot of sense.
Yeah, and there's a whole wide network of possible innovations and opportunities when you're looking at the wider botanical and fungal world. And are you working on any studies yourself right now, and any fun studies out there that we
Yeah,
could learn about that are within terpenes in the cannabis world?
Yeah, sure. Most germane would be the work that we're doing with Ryan Vondre at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. We're doing a series of studies to look at cannabinoid terpenoid combinations to try to demonstrate synergy. And these would be done under lab conditions where people be double blind. In other words, the people participating won't know what they're getting exactly, and the people who are giving it won't know what they're getting exactly. But we do before and after testing, memory and other cognitive mental functions to show salient differences. So the studies are underway, and I hope that they will serve to support synergy and the concept of the entourage effect.
Great. One of our listeners, Dr. Brian Sanderoff, is over there in Baltimore. I'm sure he's dropped a few questions in the chat, but we'll get to that. Uh, Actually, last question before we do get to the chat. Um, if you were to revise Taming THC today, how would you change it?
Not much. I certainly I've done additional work. Uh, if people want that paper and subsequent papers, it's all available at ethanrusso.org, the library tab, and there's a search there. But Jehan Marcoux and I did a subsequent paper that's actually longer. It's 70 pages, looking at um, different cannabinoids and terpenoids. Um, at this point in my career, I want to do new stuff, original research rather than review papers. Um, so again, I like the kind of thing that Ryan and I are doing to actually show how these things work in people. So from here, I hope to be doing new stuff. Um, there's plenty of good review material out there already.
That's awesome. Now, I heard you mention multiple disclaimers, multiple boards. How many boards are you serving on? How many teams are you working with? Is there room in Ethan's laboratory for more?
Uh, I get asked to do a lot of stuff. Um, again, Credo Science, our company, is pre-revenue at this point. That's a way of saying I'm not getting paid. I'm spending money.
Sounds like the cannabis world. Pre-revenue.
Pre-revenue is it means I'm living off my savings.
Yeah.
That's what it means. So another euphemism. Yeah, but again, our aim is to make cannabis safer and better. Um, and that includes approaches to the endocannabinoid system that wouldn't necessarily even use cannabis per se. So that's the thrust of what we're doing. Um, uh, yeah, I'm on a bunch of boards. So far, I'm not seeing checks from them either. Um, but yeah, eventually some of these good ideas are going to take hold and there'll be money in it, and we'll pump that into more research.
Yeah, creating long-term value for yourself, Ethan. It's all about the long game, right? Cannabis has been
Oh,
around for thousands of years, and it's going to be around for thousands of years long after we're gone. So, um, kudos to you. And with Credo Science, is that the company that sits on the boards, or is it you personally? And how
generally the
anyone
latter.
listening, how would people be able to maybe contact you if they need your services? How does that work?
Uh, well, again, I'm pretty accessible. My email is ethanrusso@comcast.net. Um, I would point out that bandwidth is an issue right now. Um, uh, we've got plenty on our plate already, but uh, there are good ideas out there, and we will certainly listen.
Okay. Well, thanks for that. Those are just some ad-libbed questions I had for you. Now for the main event. we're going to get into some questions from our guests. Thank you all 36. There was 37 at one point guests that have hung out here. It's amazing. Um, hello all from Gaetano Larderi from Newark, New Jersey. Hopefully I pronounced your name right. Gaetano left his link there. Questions. Okay, Luke Sumter, could you give us the definitional difference between terpene and terpenoid? I think you did that, but
Yes.
Luke, I think you got that. We have this on a recording, so we will be sending it back to everyone that entered their emails in the Eventbrite. Also from Luke, a recent paper in Nature reports the cannabinoid effects of several terpenes, pinene, linalool, and others. How does this finding support your previous papers?
Well, I am happy about anything that supports the entourage effect. Now, there's another side to the coin. There have been two studies out of Australia and New Zealand that had titles that implied a lack of entourage effects. So they looked at different terpenes and the binding specifically to the CB1 receptor and didn't see very much. However, that doesn't negate anything about synergy. It just means that isn't how those particular terpenoids were working. So no real surprise there. But there are already established mechanisms of synergy. We've talked about some of them today in the discussion, but yeah, I'm interested in seeing more studies in humans like we're trying to do at Johns Hopkins. And it's one of those things. I'm convinced in my position that eventually it'll be proved right. There are detractors and doubters out there. I hear all the time. But I don't lose any sleep about whether I'm right about this one. There are millions of consumers of cannabis that already know that there's a difference between one chemovar and another.
Mm-hmm. Well, my late great mentor, Michael Hollister, 54 years in cannabis, would always say to me, there's no right way, wrong way. There's just many different ways in the plant world. And that's something that I like to live by. From Melissa, does the addition of terpenes to extremely high THC strains, quote, reintroduce the entourage effect back into an imbalanced product? It's a good question.
Yeah, it could. I think the context of that is probably things like vape pens. Um, uh, it's always an issue. I mean, some vape pens can have upwards of 90% THC. I just don't know why that's necessary. Um, the endocannabinoid system is finely tuned. THC itself is what's called a weak partial agonist. That means that it binds weakly to the receptor, and that's analogous to what the endogenous cannabinoid anandamide does. What we don't need a situation is overload with too high a dose or what are called full agonists, the synthetic cannabinoids, which are way, way too strong for the system and are associated with really bad side effects. So there's something to be said for very low doses of THC with a lot of other good stuff to go along with it. But yeah, I mean, if the issue is trying to get a balance back into it, yeah, sure, that's possible by addition of terps, again, from a botanical source or ideally from cannabis itself.
Great. Thank you, Melissa. That was a great question. And from one of our colleagues at Medicine Box, Dr. Brian Sanderhoff, over there in Baltimore, Maryland. How do you feel about the, quote, pharmacologizing of terpenes by engineering products by adding non-cannabis terpenes to cannabis products?
Well, I think I've addressed this. Again, I don't want to see petroleum distillates as the source. Biosimilars from lavender. I don't see a problem with that. In the best of all possible worlds, we'd have selective breeding that gives us the profiles from cannabis itself that are going to be what the doctor ordered, so to speak. And there's nothing wrong with blending different cannabis sources. Prime example there is Sativex. So Sativex is a pharmaceutical cannabis extract preparation. It's approved in 30 countries outside the US. It's actually derived from a high THC extract and a high CBD extract, and that's perfectly kosher, even for the FDA. As long as it's all derived from the same species, that's legitimate and acceptable.
And Gaetano here, dropping aromatherapy has been around for thousands of years, since the three wise men brought frankincense and myrrh to a little baby over 2,000 years ago. There's actually a great publication I posted on my LinkedIn profile a few months ago, Gaetano, about a tomb that was over 6,000 years old. They found remnants of cannabis and frankincense in that tomb, to signify that these plants have been used in more ritual settings for many, many thousands of years. Luke, any hypotheses on how terpenes might work through the endocannabinoid biodome, I've never heard that, expanded ECS to create synergistic effects?
Sure. Well, again, the best example is caryophyllene. So it is a terpenoid, but it's working directly on the CB2 receptor. The endocannabinoidome refers to a network of related receptors. For example, beyond the cannabinoid receptors, it's clear that the TRPV1 and other TRP receptors seem to be part of the same system. And there are a lot of people that would include this serotonin 1A receptor in the endocannabinoidome. And that's one of the places that CBD works. We discovered that with my colleagues at the University of Montana back about 2005. So these things are all interrelated, and anybody that wants to try and reduce this down to where it's simple is on a fool's errand. It really is complicated. I've been working on this for 25 years, and I learned something new every day. If I didn't, I'd be in trouble, because the literature is burgeoning. We're still learning. And again, you're dealing with a system that has a foot in the door of every aspect of our function, our physiology. And so, yeah, it's going to be complicated. It'd be, when I went to school, there were only a few neurotransmitters to study. Now, there are dozens and dozens, and they all have subreceptors, subtypes, and yeah, it's complicated stuff.
We're glad you're out there unraveling all those
Yeah.
neurotransmitters
Well,
for
nobody
us.
should think I understand it all. They'd be harboring an illusion there.
We sure are trying. Dr. Danny Suarez, another colleague of ours at Medicine Box, any references on CBD achieving effect at lower dose when combined with THC or other? Are there any PK studies at universities?
Well, yeah, I mean, we've addressed this a little bit. The example I gave of the Galili study of maintaining the dose response on pain with other components. So that's a good example. We also know, in terms of pharmacokinetics, how much is in the blood and what the effect on the body is, that CBD alters the pharmacokinetics of THC. One thing it'll do is reduce the peak high. Now, that may sound like a buzzkill, but it's also helpful medicinally, because although it reduces the peak high, it means that you can take more THC without side effects. It also prolongs the duration of effect of THC. So that's very helpful for the medical patient. Yeah, so those would just be a couple of examples.
And Gaetano, are there any PK, PD ADME studies to establish API for terps.
Oh boy, really technical. So an API is an active pharmaceutical ingredient. Um, uh, Among other things, I'm working with U.S. Pharmacopoeia on standards for cannabis. We released one paper um, um, last year that is trying to establish standards of that type. And in the offing is one for cannabidiol. And there'll be more to come, but it's painstaking work. And it's mainly going to be from the lab guys about how you look for this stuff. Um, in terms of dosing, um, this is really individual. Part of the problem in trying to get cannabis-based drugs through the FDA is they're used to one size fits all. You're an adult, you weigh 80 kilos or you weigh 200 kilos, the dose is often the same. And some drugs are based on weight. You take a certain amount per kilogram per day. Well, cannabis isn't like that. You can't look at somebody and tell them what they're going to need. It's a matter of their tolerance, if any. It also has to do with a thing called endocannabinoid tone. How many cannabinoid receptors do they have? Are they active or inactive? What's the status of the enzymes in their body that make these and break these down? Right now, to study density of CB1 in the brain requires a PET scan at $10,000 a crack. So you can tell why there isn't a lot of research done on this. It's way, way too expensive. Um, uh, for dosing, if people again go to ethanrusso.org, the library there's a study uh, I did with Caroline McCollum, who's a very experienced doctor who recommends cannabis to her patients in British Columbia. So that's an article on dosing and administration. And what we did is looked at the data from the GW Pharmaceuticals Development Program, as well as all the other literature to come up with recommendations on how you administer cannabis-based products and in relation to various diagnoses. However, here's another disclaimer. Pharmacokinetic studies are done mainly because they're required by the regulators. There's not a great correlation between the amount of THC in the blood and what the effects are, because often the effects are going on in the brain, and measuring the level in the serum doesn't tell you what's going on in the brain.
All right. This may have answered this, but I just want to get Gaetano in there again. How are you establishing baseline dosing for the Hopkins studies?
Trade secret. No, I mean, this is based on pilot data. You see, part of the problem is I can just say that the people that do these studies are cannabis experienced, and some of them have tolerance, and so you have to establish a dose of THC that's going to register with them, and then follow accordingly with some proportion of terpenoid. But that's why you use different combinations and different dose levels. What you're looking for is a trend that has some consistency in a population. So I hope that answers it to some degree.
Yeah, that's good for a trade secret. And Dr. Brian Sanderoff's wife, Dr. Carrie Sanderoff at the University of Maryland, via Brian here. Um, any comments about the elephant in the room, Delta 8 THC?
Yeah, you bet. Delta 8 shouldn't be a thing, at least not the way it's currently being purveyed. So let's back up. What is it? Um, when we talk about THC, that's generally delta 9 THC. Delta 8 is what's called an isomer. It's got the same chemical formula, it's just the structure is slightly different where the hydroxyl group is. What we know about delta 8 is it's more shelf stable. That could be good. It may be somewhat less psychoactive than delta 9. It has been used clinically. There was a study in Israel in the 90s by Abrahamoff et al., and they gave this quite effectively to kids with cancer to allay nausea and vomiting during chemotherapy. Part of the hooker is they didn't see much in the way of side effects, but kids under 10 don't generally they're very tolerant to THC. What we've got going on now is the illusion that making delta 8 THC from CBD makes it legal. Well, it doesn't. And there are many attorneys that will like to disagree with me because of the Farm Bill. However, it doesn't negate the fact that the Controlled Substances Act of 1970 specifies that certain parts of hemp can be legal, but once you go to extract them or change them chemically, they're rendered illegal. Plus, as we've already said, delta 8 is an isomer of delta 9. That makes them analogs. In 1986, Congress passed an Analogs Act that basically said, if you make something that is an analog of something that's already Schedule 1, the thing you made is also Schedule 1 and illegal. So, in other words, I think delta 8 is illegal. And at any point where the FDA wants to clamp down on this or the DEA wants to clamp down on this, it'll happen. And there are many states that have already made it explicitly illegal under state law. Additionally, this stuff involves synthetic chemistry. None of it's pure. I recently had a conversation with a fellow that runs a huge lab in Canada, and he's never seen a delta 8 product that didn't also have delta 6 and delta 10 in it. We know even less about what those do. Hopefully they're not toxic, but we don't know that they're not.
That's a whole other webcast, I'm sure, with delta 8, just on that one
Well,
compound.
I think I've summarized
Yeah,
my opinion.
delta 8. Uh, Drugs are bad, okay? Delta 8 is bad, okay? I want to be mindful of everyone's time here. There are several more really great questions, so let's just fire through them. Dr. Danny again, why cannabis derived if we can verify caryophyllene from cloves that are exactly the same, analytic standard of beta caryophyllene tested? Can't we use terpenes from other plant sources when creating a terpene mix?
Yeah, I thought I said as much.
Yeah, I think you answered that previously. Um, but cannabis terpenes would be take precedence, right? And then
Well,
other.
again, those would be required in some jurisdictions.
Yeah.
And the best thing is to find a chemovar cannabis that has the profile you want, or combining different ones to give you the entourage that you require.
Absolutely. Good to see you, Mr. Manny Cordero. Manny did the first Medicine Box logo in 2016. He works with Calyx containers. Wanted to know if you have any tips on preservation of terpenes in packaging. Great question. Calyx has been minimizing space in our containers and using a FEP liner on our concentrates. Testing is coming back very high, but any recommendations?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the liner, but cannabis should be stored cool and dry and out of the light. So yeah, those are the main things. Um, uh, Ethanol is a really good preservative, and a lot of preparations that are tinctures can be shelf stable a long time. But otherwise, again, it's a closed container. Glass is good, um, out of the light, away from the heat.
All good stuff. Thanks for that question, Manny. Matthew Ladd, good to see you on here. To your point around the use of very potent cannabis pens regarding the increase in folks experiencing CHS, cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, do you believe the use of more full spectrum THC, CBD products will reduce these symptoms or possibly even counter the negative symptoms folks experience after prolonged use of highly potent THC cannabis products? Big
Yeah,
question.
this is an hour unto itself. We've just published a paper on cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome and its genetic underpinnings. So this is a condition in which people develop nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, and strange behavior of taking hot showers or baths to alleviate symptoms. This occurs only in the context of high dose, generally chronic THC usage. It's related to THC, and that's explained in the mutations that we saw in the gene testing. I wish I could say that having a profile high in CBD was going to take care of it, but that's not what people experience. And when people stop for a while, the symptoms will hopefully go away. But people don't tend to stop permanently. And when they resume, as soon as they seem to develop any tolerance again, they're susceptible to other attacks. Our paper on this is available open source at ethanrusso.org at the library. I think it's at the top. It'll be easy to find, and you can read that free, no paywall. And I'll explain. We're working on what other things might help treat this, but right now, abstinence is the answer, I'm afraid. The good part is there are many people who have equivalent levels of intake that don't develop this. Certain people with these genetic mutations seem to be susceptible to it. Unfortunately, that's not everyone.
And that's ethanrusso.org in the library,
Right.
right? That's for Matt. And okay, let's do 3 more minutes here. Melissa, what is the safety of inhaling higher levels of terpenes called terp dropping? Have these been studied for safety with inhalation? I guess, like, is it okay to inhale terpenes?
Yeah, it's okay to inhale terpenes, particularly vaporization, in the proportions that are present in cannabis flower. Okay. Uh, Straight out of the chute, that should be all right. Let's give an example. I've talked about how great alpha pinene is. However, at high concentrations, alpha pinene is irritating to the skin, potentially to the lungs. It will cause coughing. And yeah, it could be a problem. So, like anything else, we don't want too much of a good thing. Um, and I'd be really careful of concentrates. Um, Again, the proportions we see in the flower, which can be up to 5% total terps, is probably safe enough. And particularly for use other than by inhalation, there shouldn't be a big problem.
All right. That's a answer that I needed to hear as well. For all the people that asked me that. From Phil, you didn't mention eucalyptol, cineol, terpene. Is that worth a discussion? And what about possible allergic reactions to be aware of when combining certain terpenes?
Some of the terps will be sensitizers on the skin if they're exposed to light. So even limonene can break down into, gets oxidized, can produce sensitization reactions. 1,5-cineol is not something we're seeing much these days in cannabis. We did include it in the paper with John McPartland in 2001. So again, you can find that at the library. Um, it does have anti-inflammatory properties. It's got some acetylcholinesterase inhibition properties. But you'd be hard pressed to find 1,5-cineol in any concentration in most cannabis these days.
Okay, and last question from Tim. He is an avid listener on these webcasts. Thank you, Tim, for always joining. Is there a protocol that can be recommended for glioblastoma cancer patient?
Yeah, so that's the worst kind of brain tumor. What we know is even relatively low doses of THC and CBD combined with a chemotherapy agent, temozolomide, seem to have benefit there. There are papers on this that would be available at PubMed, um, Public Library of Medicine. Right.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Ethan Russo, for giving us an extra 12 minutes of your time. I know you sit on a lot of boards and you're always innovating and researching, so every minute is very grateful for everyone here. And a lot of people chimed in on the chat bar just saying how grateful they are for your continued knowledge and wisdom around the plant world and for being a valuable resource for all of us that are building companies and brands. And on behalf of myself, personally, you're a rock star in the plant world. That's why I attribute you to be the like the Jimmy Page, um, the terpene world. So thank you for joining. And everyone that has entered their email on Eventbrite, you will be able to be entered into a giveaway for the full suite of Medicine Box's one cap products. We have the Equanimity formulation for sleep, has wide range of beautiful terpenes, linalool, bisabolol, alpha humulene, and their Happy Belly for gut health, and the Vital Recovery that also has a suite of medicinal mushrooms, cannabinoids, and terpenes blended there for your overall vitality and focused energy. And I think Ethan has given out his email. I dropped his website, ethanrusso.org, in there, and the library is chock full of his publications. And thank you all so much for joining. You can find me on LinkedIn. A lot of you, it's really nice to see your names because I see you pop up on a lot of my LinkedIn posts. And it's nice to have you on here contributing to questions around the cannabis and hemp plant, that we are always a student in this classroom. And medicinebox.green, as well as medicineboxwellness.com for the hemp based products. And thank you everyone for joining. I'm going to sign off now. Thanks for joining everybody. And until next time.